Andrew Yang's UBI, the freedom dividend. Is it economic freedom or economic Armageddon? I'm going to tell you in 5 quick steps, and at the end of the video, I'm going to let you know what I think personally of UBI. Step number 1, let's frame the conversation here. One thing that really gets under my skin about Andrew Yang is he misleads the public by stating that this is the UBI that Milton Friedman, one of my personal heroes, talks about. It is nothing close to what Milton Friedman talks about, and I think that's very disingenuous of him. I really don't like that. But let's outline Yang's freedom dividend. First of all, it would not replace welfare. The benefits to welfare are actually higher when you add them all up, and studies have shown this multiple times. Now, how much higher varies, but it would be higher than the freedom dividend. So if people have the option of welfare or the freedom dividend, most of these people would choose welfare. Now, this is contrary to what Yang says or claims on his website, but I would ask him, if no one would choose welfare, then why keep it? Simple question. Moving on, Yang's dividend freedom would create more bureaucracy, higher taxes, it would leave the minimum wage, and it would de-incentivize work. Where Friedman's would eliminate welfare, it would eliminate the bureaucracy, there would be no tax increases, it would eliminate the minimum wage, and it would incentivize work. You can see how comparing this to this is basically like comparing a grapefruit to a softball just because it's the same size. They're not even close. I also want to address one of Yang's main reasons for his freedom dividend, and that's that all these workers are going to be displaced by automation and technology. But this has been happening throughout our entire history. I want to throw up a chart right now of the historical labor structure in the United States. This chart clearly shows that 200 years ago, the majority of people worked in agriculture. Now, today, almost no one works in agriculture. Also, if you go back 100 or so years, you'll see that a good portion worked in industry. Today, that's obviously not so. The majority of the people by far, in fact, as many people that we had working in agriculture over 200 years ago, we now have working in the services section of the economy. My point is the economy is always changing. There's always jobs that are being destroyed and jobs that are being created. And if your argument is that, yeah, George, but that happened over a long period of time, and this new automation, with the truck drivers as an example, that would destroy all these jobs just boom overnight. But there's been several inventions that we've had in our history that have done the exact same thing. The telephone. What happened to all the telegraph operators? Or the cotton gin. What happened to all that manual labor that used to be required to separate the cotton from the seed? All gone overnight. And it made our economy better, not worse. Step number 2, how would Andrew Yang pay for the freedom dividend? We've got to start off with how much it would cost. And at 210 million people in the United States that are above the age of 18, times $12,000, that would be $2.5 trillion per year. To see how he proposes that we pay for this, let's go to his website. Yang starts off by saying, it would be easier than you think. And you gotta love that. Whenever a politician says something's going to be easy, you know it's probably going to be the most difficult thing that you could possibly imagine. But first thing Andrew Yang says is current spending would offset some of the cost. Specifically, he says, we currently spend $500 to $600 billion a year on welfare programs, food stamps, disability, and the like. This reduces the cost of the freedom dividend because people already receiving benefits would have the choice between the two. He goes on to say, we would save $100 to $200 billion as people would be able to take better care of themselves, avoid the emergency room, jail, the street, etc. I always omit things like this because they're complete speculation. So let's just stick with the numbers and the facts. Number 2, Yang would impose a VAT tax. Our economy is incredibly vast, he says, at 19 trillion, up 4 trillion in the last 10 years alone. Of course, he doesn't account for inflation. A VAT at half the European level, or 10%, would generate an additional $800 billion in revenue. Number 3 is new revenue. Putting money into the hands of the American consumer would grow the economy. The Roosevelt Institute projected that the economy will grow by approximately $2.5 trillion and create 4.6 million new jobs. This would generate approximately 800 to 900 billion in new revenue from economic growth. Number 4, taxes on the top earners and pollution, but mostly on the top earners. By removing the Social Security cap, implementing a financial transaction tax, and ending the favorable tax treatment for capital gains and carried interest, we can decrease financial speculation while also funding the freedom dividend. So Andrew Yang says $600 billion that we now spend on welfare would offset some of the cost. Number 2, he says that the $800 billion would be generated from a new VAT tax. We'll just assume that these things are true for the time being. Number 3, he says that billions would be generated by the economic growth of people spending more money. I'm going to give him a 0 here, and the reason why is because this is just Keynesian demand-side economic nonsense. And the way that you debunk this very quickly is if our economy would boom by billions and billions of dollars, maybe trillions of dollars, because every single person was spending an additional $1,000 a month. Well, why not just give them $2,000 a month? Why not just give them $5,000 a month? If that logic holds true at 1,000, it would definitely hold true at 5,000, right? The answer is no, and that's why I'm giving him a 0 for how much economic growth would be generated as a result of the freedom dividend. And in fact, we might have less economic growth. I'll go into that in a moment. Number 4 is the balance would be absorbed by several different taxes. The main ones are increasing capital gains tax and removing the cap on Social Security. But let's think about this for a moment. Let's go back to our very simple economy that we always use. We have this guy produces cows, this guy wheat, this guy cotton. And remember, at the core of a healthy economy is that people produce more than they consume. And this leads to savings or an excess of supply. So if this guy is producing more cows than he's consuming, this guy more wheat, this guy more cotton, they're going to trade that for the local currency. That currency is going to go to the investment entity. And notice I said investment entity, and I didn't say bank. Because a lot of people in the comments say, George, that's not how the modern day banking system works. And I get it. But the bottom line is that excess productivity goes into an investment vehicle that reallocates that capital into a productive source, or hopefully a productive source. In this case, the entity would invest back into the gentleman that was producing the cows and the guy producing the wheat. We'll say the guy producing cotton isn't making that much money right now, so they're going to hold off on giving him a loan. So this guy takes that money to produce even more cows. This guy takes that money to produce even more wheat. And the more cows and the more wheat that they can produce, that means the fewer cows and the fewer amount of wheat that the rest of the economy has to produce to fulfill their needs. That means that the rest of the people in the economy can be a doctor. They can be a teacher, or they can go off and start the next company. They can be the next Elon Musk. If you don't like him, they could be the next Steve Jobs. And the reason they can do that is because these people are producing more than they consume. The tax increases that Andrew Yang is proposing to pay for the freedom dividend would take resources away from investment and move it into consumption. And you may say, George, well, that doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But yeah, let's analyze this a little bit further. If there's less money going into investment, that means the guy that produces wheat doesn't get his loan. If he can't produce more wheat, then that means there's more people in the economy that have to produce their own wheat. Therefore, we have fewer Steve Jobs and Elon Musks, fewer teachers, and fewer doctors. Another fallacy that is very common is that these people who are producing more than they consume, this excess production just goes in their bank account, just sits there and does nothing. Or they just dig a hole in their backyard and just play around with all that extra money and it doesn't go into the economy. Of course, that's complete nonsense because as we can see in this little example, it does go back into the economy, but it goes back into the economy in a productive way instead of just pure consumption. So it's clear that if we divert resources like this, we'll have less growth in the economy, not more. That means the balance of the difference between the 600, 800, and the 2.5, so let's call it $1 trillion, would come straight from either money printing or additional debt. Step number 3, what are the freedom dividend benefits? To find out, let's go back to Andrew Yang's website. UBI encourages people to find work. And I want to point out here that Yang does admit that the current welfare system de-incentivizes people to actually go out and find work. So again, I would ask him the question, why keep the current welfare system? Next, UBI reduces bureaucracy, but I'd like to add only when you replace the current welfare system. If you don't replace the current welfare system, UBI adds bureaucracy. Next, UBI increases bargaining power for the worker. UBI increases entrepreneurship. UBI improves mental health. UBI helps people make smarter decisions. UBI improves physical health. UBI increases art production and nonprofit work and caring for loved ones. UBI improves labor market efficiency. And UBI improves relationships. Of course, the first thing that I want to point out that if UBI is this amazing and it makes people smarter, healthier, it improves their relationships, why wouldn't we want that for the people that are currently on welfare? Doesn't make any sense to me. But there are several things that I don't think Andrew Yang has thought through. And I'll be the first person to admit that I don't think Friedman really thought them through as well. First and foremost, if everyone is getting the benefit of UBI, why wouldn't everyone vote to continually increase UBI? Right now, we've got checks and balances that the majority of the people are not on welfare. If every single person was on welfare, and if we live in a democracy, we would just vote in the person that would continually increase our benefits. This is a huge moral hazard, and I don't think anyone's paying any attention to this. Next, I would have to wonder why anyone would stay in the United States, especially young people. Let me explain. The UBI, wherever it's been tried before, Yang references several studies. You'll notice that it's never been done in a country that borders another country where the cost of living is substantially lower. But if I'm someone that's 18, 19, and I live right here in Arizona or in California, why on earth would I not just go across the border, live there, don't work, or maybe even start a business? Because $1,000 a month here in Mexico, when the peso is at 19 to 1, you could save a lot of that money and start an online business. Taking it a step further, if you live on the East Coast, why on earth wouldn't you just move down to Colombia where you're getting 3,500 pesos to the dollar? The bottom line is if I'm a young person, staying in the United States would make no sense to me whatsoever. And I think that you'd have a brain drain with a lot of our talented kids that are coming out of high school, especially nowadays when making money online is so popular and so doable that these smart kids would just leave the country. Step number 4 is VAT passed down to the consumer. Let's hear what Andrew Yang has to say about that. Yang says no. Not all goods would be subject to the VAT. Staples such as groceries and clothing would be excluded. Second, the assumption that the entire VAT, notice he says entire, would be passed down to the consumer is incorrect. While prices will likely increase on many goods, which he admits, the increase will, for the most part, be smaller than the VAT, as producers find more efficient ways to produce goods and adjust prices to maximize profitability. And I really want you to pay special attention to that. Maximize profitability. First, let me go ahead and debunk what he says about the price of staples not going up because they are exempt. If we have a grocery store right here, the prices that it charges the consumers is going to be subject to its input costs. And for this grocery store, its main input costs, other than the goods themselves, would most likely be rent and labor. Remember that Yang says because of the freedom dividend, labor would have much more bargaining power, which means the cost of labor, according to Yang, would increase. Also, with the rent, remember he wants to increase the capital gains tax. He actually wants to double it. So if you're a landlord that is going to get less return on your money when you go to sell that property, that means you're going to need to make up that money by increasing your cash flow. In other words, raising rent. So the grocery store's rent will go up, its labor cost will go up, and even if it isn't subject to the VAT, because of the freedom dividend proposal, prices will go up, which means consumers will pay more. Next is this bizarre concept that the prices won't increase that much because businesses will try to maximize profits, so they'll be more efficient. But if business owners are so greedy, like the left wants us to believe, wouldn't they be maximizing profits right now, regardless of the freedom dividend? The answer is yes, of course they would. And I'd also like to remind everyone that an increase in prices, in other words, inflation, is a transfer of wealth. It's a transfer of wealth from savers to consumers. And as we all know, a healthy economy is about savings or producing more than you consume and investing the difference. So because we have this transfer of wealth from where it should be to where it shouldn't be, that further hurts the economy. Step number 5, would Andrew Yang's freedom dividend cause inflation? His answer is extremely revealing. Let's go right back to his website. The federal government recently printed $4 trillion for bank bailouts in its quantitative easing program with no inflation. Our plan for UBI uses mostly money already in the economy. In monetary economics, leading theory states that inflation is based on changes in the money supply. Let's focus on that. Based on changes in the money supply. The freedom dividend has minimal changes in the supply of money because it is funded by a VAT. So right after Yang says there wouldn't be inflation, he goes on to say it's likely that some companies will increase their prices in response to having more buying power. And he admits VAT would also increase prices. But somehow, remember, there wouldn't be any inflation, it's just prices will increase. However, there will be competition between firms that will keep prices in check. Over time, technology will continue to decrease the prices of most goods where it is allowed to do so. And this is where it really starts to get interesting. The main inflation we currently experience is in sectors where automation has not been applied due to government regulation or inapplicability, primarily housing, education, and healthcare. The real issue isn't UBI, it's whether technology and automation will be allowed to reduce prices in different sectors. So what he's saying is that big government gets in the way of increasing our standard of living, but yet every single one of his proposals increases the size of government. First, I want to address his bailout of $4 trillion not causing inflation. And somehow this means that if we do it again, but in a different way, there's no way that it'll cause inflation again because it didn't 10 years ago. Let's think this through. Fed's QE, they print money out of nowhere. That definitely increases the money supply. That money is taken by the primary dealers to purchase treasuries from investment funds. The investment funds take those bonds, they give them right to the Fed, and that is held on the Fed's balance sheet. This creates more demand for those bonds, which technically should decrease the interest rate. The lower that interest rate goes, according to the Fed, that will prompt these investment funds to take that money and invest in something where they can get a higher return, such as risk assets. And I would also argue that it incentivizes the investment funds to actually go out and buy more bonds as well. So the whole point is all this new money, that $4 trillion, has stayed within the financial economy and has specifically and almost exclusively gone into the purchase of assets. You have this distinct line between these two economies. We'll call this the real economy. And while all these shenanigans are going on over here in the real economy, where the money supply increases by banks lending more, we didn't have a big increase there. Why? The banks wanted to lend. They said, hey guys, borrow money. We got tons. We can print it out of nowhere. We can just create it just with a keystroke on our computer. But the consumer says we can't. We can't borrow any more money. We don't have enough income because we are tapped out. This is why you had huge inflation over here and very little inflation over here. Then at the same time, Yang says that prices will rise. He also says that prices won't rise because his proposal won't create inflation because it won't increase the supply of money. Well, first of all, my hat's off to him because he's using the Austrian definition of money supplies. So that's good. But he's really referring to price inflation. And what Andrew Yang forgets to mention, I think conveniently, is that it's not just about the money supply. It's about the velocity of money. How fast is that money circulating within our system? And remember, going back to the Roosevelt Institute, got to be a great financial institution if it's named after literally the worst president in American history. But they said that the freedom dividend would increase spending. Okay, well, if you're taking money from savers who invest that money and giving it to consumers who spend that money right away as soon as they get it, how will that not increase the velocity? And now let's address the money supply specifically. Remember, we concluded that there's no way Yang can pay for all of this without printing money or borrowing the money. So let's think this through. The government borrows money by issuing bonds. And there are trillions and trillions of dollars outside of the US economy in all these foreign countries. And a lot of people who buy bonds are these entities in foreign countries. So if the government is selling more debt, that means potentially there's a lot more dollars coming to the US economy that isn't circulating within the economy right now. While borrowing might not directly increase the amount of dollars that we have in the world, it definitely could increase the amount of dollars that are circulating within the United States economy. And more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services equals price inflation, especially when you add to that an increase of velocity. And then he says that although consumers have more purchasing power, that prices won't increase because there will be plenty of competition. Well, I've got two words for Andrew Yang: college tuition. As we all know, student loan debt is astronomical. And why is that? Because before, students or consumers had this much money to spend on college. Prices were low. Now they have this much money to spend on college. And the government comes in and regulates the colleges and universities so heavily that if you're someone that runs a college, why on earth would you expand when your profits keep going up and up and up and up? Because they have so much more purchasing power, that is your consumer, and the government makes it so onerous on you to expand. So we're then left with the classic example of much more money chasing the same amount of goods and services, which equals all-time high prices in college tuition. And that means that when students get done, when they graduate, they've got 200 grand in debt and they're working at Starbucks and driving an Uber. I want to point out that a solution could be to reduce the amount of regulations, so there could be more colleges that would soak up that additional money and keep prices down. But because the government regulates things so heavily, they're not allowed to do that. And that is one of the main catalysts of all this price inflation. And what does Andrew Yang want to do to normal businesses? He wants to regulate them even further. If you go through his website, almost every one of his proposals would increase the amount of regulation on businesses. And an increase in regulation equals fewer goods and services produced. Fewer goods and services produced equals higher price inflation, exactly like we've seen in college tuition. So what is Andrew Yang's freedom dividend endgame? Well, it increases regulation. That means it decreases goods and services. It most likely increases the money supply circulating within the United States. It definitely increases velocity. And even Yang himself admits that it will raise prices. All of that equals price inflation, which is very, very bad. Price inflation would most likely lead to higher interest rates, and higher interest rates would crush asset prices, debt, and consumer confidence. And as we all know, this is the foundation of sand that our entire economy is built on. So what do I think about UBI? I love Friedman's version of it, and I hate Yang's version of his freedom dividend. Moreover, I'm not sure that in today's economy and in this environment that is so extremely sensitive to high inflation, that even Friedman's UBI would be a good idea, because we would risk utter devastation to the entire economy. For more information like this, check out this content right here, and I will see you on the next video.